We missed one. Last week we left off that Chodesh Elul is a Chodesh of cheshbon nefesh, and the cheshbon has to emanate from the nefesh in itself, from the soul in itself, knowing, as we discussed, as per the Rebbe's letter, the proper valuation of oneself. Because if, as the teaching goes, if you gauge a fish based on its ability to fly, it's going to fail every single time. But if you gauge a bird based on its ability to remain underwater and swim and live underwater, it's going to fail every single time as well. Proper cheshbon begins with the nefesh in itself, with the soul, with the ability of oneself to recognize who they are and what they're here to accomplish. From this perspective, as we discussed last week, we are given gates, because last week's parsha began that shoftim v'shotrim titen b'chol sha'arecha. We must appoint judges and officers in all of our gates. And as we discussed on Shabbat, there is a service of the mind, which is the judges, that the mind has to, based on the Torah, create a ruling of one's personal standing. Who are they and what are they here to accomplish? And then the officers and the emotions must act according to the ruling and must implement the ruling as per the judge's instructions. Furthermore, there's an inyan of what's called the officers as Kabbalah soul, of accepting the yoke of heaven. The rule is a rule no matter what. Like it or you don't like it, you must do, or you must not do. There's one more point before we get into today's talk, which is while increasing acts of goodness and kindness, while increasing good thoughts and good words and good deeds is foundationally important. And sometimes that's the way we ought to lead, with acts of goodness and kindness. But nevertheless, in conducting a healthy evaluation of oneself, we have to assess in which particular gate does a yetzer hara come through. Just like if there's a breach in a gate, for example, in a border or something to that effect, and that's where these strangers are able to come in, then before we add more positive policies, or as we're adding more positive policies for the country in itself, we have to also close off and fix those holes in order for the other side not to be able to come in. So too with ourselves. Each and every one of us has a particular points in which the yetzer hara is able to enter and finesse our minds, finesse our emotions, and redirect us and revise our sense of self and our sense of purpose. For this reason, we're instructed that we need to make sure that every single one of our gates is intact. We have to know, for some people, their gates are their eyes. They see what other people have and what they don't have. Or the ears, they hear things that manipulate the way that they think. Or it's speech, or it's or any of those gates that we are triggered with. It's not enough just to add an act of goodness and kindness, but to remedy immediately, to resolve to immediately to remedy every single one of the discrepancies that thus far has created a hole in which the goodness seems to be siphoned from. Let's go on to this week's Parshat Ki Tetel Milchama. The parsha begins Ki Tetel Milchama al Oivecha. If you go out to war over your enemies, and Hashem your Lord will deliver him, will give him over your enemy into your hands, and you took captives from him. The Rebbe begins this talk from 1989 with several driving questions. First of all, a question regarding the verbiage. Question number one: Lama lo lemar? Why did the Torah say Ki tetel milchama im oivecha? Why did the Torah say when you go to war with your enemies? Usually, when one goes to war, it's against another side, with another side. But over here, the verbiage is when you go to war over your enemies. Number two, Maush v'shavitu shivyo, and the second part, what does it mean that you will take his captives? And not just and you will take captives. In other words, if the Torah wanted to spell out the laws of taking captive prisoners of war, it could have just said, and you took captives. We learn many times that every single word in the Torah in itself, including the verbiage and the positioning, is part of the instruction. Furthermore, aloivecha, and furthermore, when the Torah says you will go to war over your enemies, it is a direct contradiction to that you captive his captives. Because aloivecha, when you go to war over your enemies, implies that we have the leverage over our enemies at time of war. In other words, even though there's a reality of an enemy, and what's an enemy? An enemy is an entity that stands in direct and extreme conflict with who you are. And the war is to be able to either to push one side and then take over in order to introduce the victor's policy over the other side. But here the Torah says, you'll go to war over your enemy, which means we have the upper hand. It's not a fair war. And so even though there is a reality of an enemy in itself, to the extent that we must go out to war with him, nevertheless, this is not a war between two equal sides. But the Jewish people have the vantage points, the leverage over the enemy. And furthermore, another inference over here is that that the reality that we bear leverage over our enemies, as Rebbe puts in parentheses, over implies yes, we have the leverage. But a leverage implies already a proximity, a relative positioning. As we have an enemy, but we have the upper hand. I know that, but as Rebbe explains, that as the Torah says, you'll go to war over your enemy, means, yes, we have the leverage in proximity. However, that's only when we go out to war. In other words, when we go out from our natural settings to wage war over the enemy, over there is a relative position, except that we have the upper hand. But as Chassidus explains, and we're going to really delve into this instruction, this mitzvah that Hashem is giving us over here, is referring to the soul's descent from its origins in Atzilut. In the world of Atzilut, the first of four worlds, Atzilut means in proximity to Ein Sof, a world where the light of Ein Sof openly radiates. Over there, there's no enemy. There's no such reality as an enemy. In the world of Atzilut, as Hasidus and Kabbalah explains, it's a world of sheer goodness and light, of sheer bitul, of nullification to God. For that reason, Ein Sof could be openly revealed there. In that world where our souls originate from, there is no enemy. There's no conflict. There's no deceit. There's no hindrance. There are no hindrances or blockages or anything of darkness. When the neshama goes out of that world and descends into the subsequent three worlds and eventually end up in this, the fourth of four worlds, the lowest of the worlds, a world that the Torah itself describes as a world of deceit and constriction and darkness. For the reason, as we're going to see, in order, as we discussed many times, to transform this world to be an inhabitable place for him, there is a requirement of going out of Atzilut, because in Atzilut we cannot conduct this type of war because there's no enemy there. There's no restrictions. There are no limitations. And specifically in this war. So when the neshama, in this world, and for that reason, when the neshama descends into this world, there's a reality of an enemy, and an enemy that stands in direct opposition to us and to God. But nevertheless, we need to know that we have the vantage point. But from the sheer aspect of the essence of who we are, from the soul perspective, and a soul is a piece of God from the above, an actual piece of God from the above, to the extent that, as the Zohar says, that the Jewish people and Hashem are one. From the essential truth, there's no relative positioning or connection between us and an enemy. Not even a proximity that there is an enemy, but we have the vantage points. We have the essential leverage over that. There's no connection to an enemy. That reality doesn't even exist from the essential point. So on one hand, when the Torah begins, you should go, when you go to war over your enemy, the Torah is giving us a clear indication that we have the advantage point over the enemy, except that we have to go out. On the other hand, towards the end of the pasuk, v'shivita shivyo, and you will take from his captives. That in itself is indicative of how strong the enemy is, how mighty this enemy is. In other words, there could be an enemy, and as we've seen in the end of last week's parsha, that could actually wage war against us and take us as captives. But furthermore, that even when we do come out the victor over their enemies, and when we take captives, the Torah refers to it as his captives. In other words, even when we took captive, they still bear the marking of being the other side's captives. So again, 1 second. So again, let's summarize the driving questions. The pasuk begins, the Torah portion begins, and you'll be, and when you go to war